Good evening, everyone. For anyone that doesn't know me, I'm Hilary McGrady. I'm the Director General of the National Trust, and it's my huge pleasure to be able to welcome you this evening to our third Octavia Hill Lecture. This is the point in the year where we get to ask an expert in their field for their reflections on what is it about the past that is so relevant to our current way of being, and of course, how is it going to influence our future going forward? Something that we reflect on all of the time in the Trust. I am absolutely thrilled, of course, that tonight we have Professor Alice Roberts with us taking the lecture this evening. And of course, she follows wonderful Mary Baird last year and Neil McGregor in our first year. So we're really looking forward to that. I can't resist, of course, though, because I've got the mic, to say a few words of my own about why two, in particular, archaeological assets in the National Trust are particularly resonating with me right now, and you're going to need to forgive me a little bit, because I can't pretend to be an expert in this, but I'm going to start with this one. So he's big, he's 180 feet, he's very bold in lots of ways, he's audacious, and a lot of people know him. He certainly attracts an awful lot of media coverage every year, and inevitably, forgive me, there's usually the odd wag that will say or talk about how wonderfully well the National Trust looks after its members. But why is he resonating with me right now? Well, actually, along with the many other chalk figures around the country, these were wonderful symbols of all sorts of different things at the time, created by people. People digging, people carving, people putting their heart and soul into these wonderful, wonderful images and symbols. Some of them we understand, some of them they don't, but collectively, to this day, they draw attention. People are flocked to them to see them. And actually, to this day, people still have to care for them. Volunteers make sure those lines are neat and tidy, and they hammer that chalk in to make sure that it's bright and vibrant and you can see it from miles around. And that's a very good excuse for me to talk about something else that is bold and ambitious and crafted with a huge amount of care, and certainly crafted through people coming together. 70,000 people have contributed to the development of the National Trust's new strategy for the next 10 years. We've talked to people for just about 2 years, actually, about what they want from the National Trust, but more importantly, what they want from nature, from beauty, and from history, wherever they are, whether they live in the middle of a city or whether they live in rural England or Northern Ireland or Wales. We asked them what they wanted, what they needed, and then we joined that in with what the National Trust wants to achieve. And we've come up with this very, very bold and audacious strategy for the next 10 years, which I guess I hate the word strategy, but think of it as a roadmap to take us forward to do three big things, big and bold, just like the Cernabus. The first is to restore nature, not just to stop the decline. We know that the decline of nature is catastrophic, but we are going to restore it. Can't do it ourselves, and we won't be doing it just on our own land. We'll need to do it with other people. We want to restore a piece of land that's as big as Greater London, that's going to be wonderfully abundant with nature, and it's going to be accessible to people. That is bold, that is ambitious, but we believe we can do it if we work with others. Our second big ambition is to end unequal access to that beauty, that nature, that history that we all take for granted, frankly, but an awful lot of people have no access to right across this country, and particularly people living in urban areas. Millions of people, no access to any of those things. So again, this is not about just what we do at our places, albeit they will need to work even harder to be ever more accessible, to be used and to be useful. But we want to work with other people who bring heritage and nature and beauty and history to people wherever they are. And again, we'll do that in partnership with them and alongside of them. And then the third one is to inspire millions to want to be like the volunteers who do that work on the Cernabus, to play their part, to care, to want to make a difference. And I guess this is an opportunity for me to say thank you to all of you, because the very fact that you've turned up tonight is a start to wanting to play your part. And actually, a lot of you have gone even further than that. A lot of you have already contributed your time, your money, your support in so many different ways. So thank you, because it's so important to everything that the National Trust does. But here's another little archaeological find that says just as much as that big Cernabus. So this is affectionately known as the Wimpole figurine, because he was dug up in 2021, so very recently, when we were actually creating a car park for Wimpole. We don't know a huge amount about him, other than he might look like a Celtic sort of figure, but actually he was created by the Romans. You can't really see it there, but he actually has a little moustache and a very trendy mullet. Now, who knew that mullets were a thing before the 1980s? But clearly, what this little figurine does start to tell you is a little bit about how life might have been in those times. A tiny little window into a past that we constantly learn more about day and daily, and Alice is going to be talking more about that. But the reason this resonates with me is because actually we can have all the big ambitions in the world. We can be audacious in our ideas, and Rennie talks about moonshots, but actually it's the little things that make the difference. It's the day and daily things that people do, whether it's a volunteer welcoming you to, when you come to one of our places, whether it's the painstaking conservation that someone is doing on a tapestry, whether it's the wonderful beavers that we were able to release legally a couple of weeks ago at Purbeck. These are all small things that make a very big difference when you add them all together. Now it is with my great pleasure I'd like to welcome Alice to the stage. Thank you.
Welcome everybody to the Royal Society this evening. It's my absolute delight to be giving the Octavia Hill Lecture this evening for the National Trust in collaboration with Times Radio. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why I love the National Trust and have loved it for quite a while. And then I'm going to transport you back in time, because that's what I like doing. And there will be some bones, of course, because it's me. So I first became involved with the National Trust as a member, I think it was about 25 years ago. I was walking along the coast path in Cornwall, and I was walking along that coast path with my then boyfriend, now husband, and we had this wonderful holiday walking up and down these cliffs, and it was just stunning. I mean, it's the North Cornish coast. We started at St Ives and made our way southwest, winding our way up and down. And I remember one day where we sat and we made a little cup of tea. We had a tiny little burner, and we sat there and had a lovely cup of tea, which is a very important thing for the National Trust, obviously. But we made our own. And we sat there on the springy turf, and there were fulmars flying along the edge of the cliffs on the updraft. And my now husband said something rather poetic to me along the lines of, isn't it wonderful just being so close to nature that you feel you're part of it? And at that moment, with perfect comic timing, a little brown bird flew over us and shat on his leg. Honestly, it's true. It's not an apocryphal story. It actually happened. So I like being close to nature, but not that close to it. And when we finished our coast path walk, we were so grateful to all the people who had cut the gorse back and the brambles and allowed us to have this magical experience. All those volunteers that Hilary mentioned that, really are the lifeblood of the National Trust, that we became members, and we've been members ever since. And then my father-in-law was a volunteer. And it depends so much, not only on membership and donations, but on that work that people do to keep these places open, to go back to the origins of the National Trust, which was about preserving and protecting places of natural beauty and historic interest, and making them accessible to everybody. It's that accessibility which is incredibly important. I've always loved being that close to nature and areas of historic interest. And I think my love of the natural world drew me into studying biology to begin with, and I was a medic for a while. But it was as though the past was always stalking me, because I got dragged into a career where I've spent most of that career, I think I can sum it up in saying I've been searching for ancestors. And I occupy this slightly strange intersection between biology and history, and what I've been writing about mostly is this intersection between genetics and archaeology, and it's opening our eyes to the past in a way that we just haven't had available to us before, making the past more accessible in all sorts of ways. So I've been writing about that, and I'm going to share some stories that I've come across in recent years, which really illustrate, I suppose, the way that we can learn about ourselves, perhaps by looking at ancestors in the landscape, thinking about the people that enjoyed these landscapes long before we came along, looking at the connections between different groups of people that we can now examine in a way that we haven't been able to before, and hopefully, as I said, learning something about ourselves along the way as well. So I'm interested in the traces of our ancestors in the landscape. I go on walks a lot. I love walking. My children are well aware of this fact. And I always like a walk that combines those two things, natural beauty and historic interest. I call them my monumental walks. Children are very, very familiar with my monumental walks. And as I'm walking along in the landscape, I've got this feeling that there are people behind me that I could turn around and see ghosts. I've got this feeling that the landscape of Britain is full of ghosts. And this is odd. I'm in no way religious. I'm a humanist. I do not believe in ghosts. I don't believe in anything supernatural. And yet they're there, aren't they? You can't go very far in Britain without finding physical, tangible traces of ancestors in the landscape. And they're in prominent places. They want us to know that they're still there, that they're speaking to us through the ages. They've left these monuments, these traces of their lives for us to contemplate today. And sometimes, of course, they've left themselves as well. And this is my particular interest, the stories that we can glean from burial archaeology, from buried ancestors, looking at their bones, but also looking at the culture which goes with them. When you have a grave like this, it's like a time capsule. It really is. It's an overused phrase, but it really is a time capsule. The bones take us into the biography of that person in a way that we can now use lots of different scientific techniques to understand aspects of their stories that we wouldn't have been able to 10 or 20 years ago. The objects that are buried with people in graves like this are coming to us with a context. They're not just found in a midden, in a rubbish pit on an archaeological dig. They're coming with a person. So they clearly had meaning for that person or for the people that buried them, and probably both. So we see culture in a context that perhaps we don't in other archaeological sites. So if we look for traces of humans in the British landscape, how far back can we go? Well, that's changed immensely during the course of my own lifetime. We've pushed the earliest, or at least our knowledge of the earliest human traces of in the landscape back about 500,000 years. So going back to the late 90s, we knew that there were humans in Britain 400,000 years ago. We've actually got some remains, not much, bit of a leg, a couple of teeth, from somebody who wasn't human like us, but was human nonetheless. So a member of the species Homo heidelbergensis that was around in Britain that many years ago. But since then, actually, as I said, we've pushed it back even further. So we've got incredible archaeology from the East Coast, from Norfolk in particular, showing us that people, some sort of people, were here in Britain going back as early as 900,000 years ago. It's quite astonishing. It pushes us right back into the Ice Age. We've got stone tools like this hand axe. We've also got, and these always blow me away because they shouldn't survive for a day, let alone all those millennia. We've got footprints from 900,000 years ago, which is just phenomenal, on the beach at Haysborough. And so we know that there were people all those millennia ago in Britain. We know that people came and went because this pushes us back into the Ice Age, and we see people in Britain in these gaps in the Ice Age, these interglacials, when the world warms up a bit and actually Britain is a reasonable place to live in. And then for great long stretches of time, it goes back to being completely unlivable. The ice sheets descend from the north and come down as far as us here. To the south of us, it's just tundra, and there's no people here. But whenever it warms up a little bit, we find people. Sometimes Neanderthals, so we have Neanderthals in Britain. And then we get to 40,000 years ago, and there's a fragment of a jawbone from Kent's Cavern, where we think this fragment of a jawbone dates to about 40,000 years ago, and it's very much modern human by this point. And what I mean by modern, because you might be thinking 40,000 years ago seems like not very modern to me, but it's Homo sapiens. It's somebody who is basically the same species as us. We have to wait a little bit longer to get the first burial, though. Another 10,000 years, a mere 10,000 years by this point, when we've been on a journey which has been hundreds of thousands of years long. And this burial comes from a very special place on the coast of South Wales. So this is the Gower in South Wales, and this is Paviland Cliffs, very, very beautiful, kind of iconic limestone outcropping cliffs. And you can see in those cliffs, there's a little teardrop-shaped tear, a hole in them, and that is the famous Paviland Cave. Well, famous if you're someone like me who's fascinated by burials. My first ever bit of work with the BBC was Coast back in the day, 20 years ago. And we were talking to the producers, and they said, if you could, what stories do you think we should include? And I said, you've got to include this. This is stunning. This is the first burial in Britain. And it goes back a very, very long way indeed. The discovery goes back a long way too, and it was rather mysterious because it was misunderstood when it was discovered. So it was discovered in the 19th century, in 1822, 1823, and it was discovered by women who have almost completely been written out of this history. The Lady Mary Cole, who was the landowner on the Gower, and her daughters were very interested in the objects that they were finding in these caves, particularly bones. They were finding really unusual bones in these caves. And they were really interested in the new sciences of geology and paleontology. They were following the first professor of geology at Oxford University, the Reverend William Buckland, and his publications. And they were interested because he'd been writing about a very ancient hyena den that he'd been excavating in Yorkshire. And they thought, oh, maybe we've got something similar. And Buckland was really pushing the boat out at the time, saying, look, there were hyenas in Britain. There were animals in Britain that have since gone extinct. And Lady Mary Cole and Mary Teresa Talbot, her daughter, thought, maybe we've got the same. They started writing to Buckland. They sent him some samples from their cave, and he didn't waste much time. So that was in December 1822. 18th of January 1823, he was down on the Gower with them, staying with them and taking over the excavations. So he took over this excavation and he dug down into the floor of this limestone cave, and he started finding more remains of ancient animals, which he recognized as being some kind of elephant, their mammoth. And he thought, oh yeah, this is what I'm interested in. I think I've got antediluvial animals here. He was still working on the premise that the biblical flood was real, and he was looking from animals before the biblical flood. It took him until right the end of his career before he realized that actually he was wrong about the watery nature of that crisis, and actually it was ice ages that he was looking at. Anyway, at the time he was looking for antediluvial remains, and he was a bit surprised to find a human, because he didn't think humans could possibly have existed at the same time as these antediluvial elephants. So even though it was discovered in the same layer, as far as he was concerned, this skeleton couldn't possibly be that old, couldn't be antediluvial, even though he wasn't quite sure how old antediluvial was. So he looked at the remains. This is the illustration from his report, and it shows, as you can see, a fairly complete skeleton. It's a little bit of an exaggeration, because actually this is what he found. So just really the left side of a skeleton. There isn't a skull. There's a bit of pelvis. The bones are stained red, and he mentions this in his report. He talks about the bones being stained with a red ruddle, he calls it. And it's not the colour of the cave. So the cave is limestone, the floor is a yellowish loam, so it isn't as though these bones have taken on the colour from the sediments that they were buried in. So this was curious. He recognised that as being curious. He also recognised the curiosity of all these objects that seem to be associated with the burial. So he described 2 handfuls of periwinkles down by the hip of this individual. He described lots of ivory rods, some of which were 10 centimetres long, that were scattered around this person in their grave as well. And he couldn't really make up his mind about this. When he started thinking about it, he discussed it with Lady Mary Cole, and he said, I think it's probably a murdered exciseman. There'd been lots of bust-ups with smugglers and tacksmen along the coast at that point. So he thought it might be a fairly recent grave. And then when he got back to Oxford, he reassessed and thought, no, I don't think it is. And he wrote to Lady Mary Cole. All the letters are there online in the National Museum Wales website, and they're just fantastic. They're very entertaining, both of those individuals. I would have loved to have met them both. He writes to her and he says, no, the skeleton cannot be an exciseman, but neither can it be an antediluvial human. I've decided it's not. First of all, it's a female skeleton. And secondly, I've decided it probably has something to do with the British camp on the hill above. So he'd made this kind of connection between the skeleton in the cave and this, what turned out to be an Iron Age hill fort. He thought it was probably Roman. So he's at that point placing the skeleton about 2,000 years ago when it was buried. He thinks it's female. I think he's decided that because of the objects which he thinks might be jewellery. And of course, if it's got jewellery with it, it must be female. He goes a bit further than that. He starts to embroider this, and we know that in his lectures to the undergraduates at Oxford, he goes as far as talking about her running a gambling den in the cave, and these are gaming counters. It all gets more and more elaborate and very entertaining, but completely wrong. I mean, completely wrong. We can forgive him for some of this because he couldn't date the remains. We're back in the 19th century. We're so used now to thinking, oh, well, you've got human bone. It's organic. You can radiocarbon date it. You can stick a date on that. You don't have to try and, just do it by layers and a bit of guesswork. You can actually take a sample and stick a date on it. He couldn't do that. But he should have been able to know that it wasn't a woman, because this is a classically male pelvis. And he was actually quite a good anatomist. So he's been so hoodwinked by the fact that she's, as far as he's concerned, got shell beads with her, that she must be female. But this is, there's lots of things I could point out here, but this is a very narrow greater sciatic notch. I mean, it's just clearly not female at all. Sometimes you look at a pelvis and go, well, I'm not quite sure, because the bones vary on a spectrum. But at either end of the spectrum, you've got very definite male and very definite female, and this falls into the very definite male category. So it's definitely a man, which he got wrong, and he was also way out with the age of it. But we weren't to know that until radiocarbon dating came along. So in the 60s, some scientists had a go with rudimentary radiocarbon dating, pretty good, but for the time, and they came out with a date of 18,000 years ago, which was phenomenal and impossible, because 18,000 years ago is very close to the peak of the last ice age, the last glacial maximum, one of these times when the ice sheets would have come down this far and the rest of Britain was completely uninhabitable. So, it was one of those kind of like, well, okay, it's obviously wrong. We might revisit this at a later date. And then in the 90s, my very good friend Paul Pettit was at the Oxford Radiocarbon Lab, and they decided to have another go. And actually, they didn't need to go and resample the bones because they already had the samples left over from the earlier radiocarbon dating. They ran the tests again with slightly more sophisticated techniques, and they came out with a date of 31,000 years ago. And since then, it's even been pushed back a bit further, stripping out any contamination to 34,000 years ago. And you might think, oh, it's just going to keep going, isn't it? We think it's settled now. So 34,000 years ago, this individual was buried. This man was buried in that cave on the Gower. Now, that is possible because that's before the peak of the last ice age, when the world would have been cooling down, but was still a livable environment in Britain. And we know that because we've got other animals around at that time as well. So it's an incredibly early burial. And then if we go back and imagine the burial of this individual and what his life was like and what exactly is going on here, we can come up with kind of artistic representations like this, where you've got ideas about what people are doing. I mean, we can't test these ideas, this artist has imagined that the ivory wands might be something Harry Potter-esque. They might be bead blanks. It's still a bit of a mystery. They're obviously culturally important. There's a lot of them in the grave. And maybe one day we'll be able to unlock that secret. The red ruddle is interesting that Buckland did pick up on, because it definitely isn't in the cave, as I said. So it must have come in at the same time as the individual was buried. We don't know how. Here we've got the red ochre being scattered over the burial, perhaps representing blood or something. I don't know, but it's an artistic interpretation. It could have been that the ochre was dyeing blankets that were placed over the body, or maybe his clothes. It could have been that it was painted on his skin. We don't know, but it's arrived in the grave with him, definitely. And then the other fascinating thing about this burial is if we put all those things together. So you've got somebody who is buried with all these objects, with that ochre, which is somehow symbolic and important. There are similar burials across Europe and as far away as Sunga in Russia, where we see this ochre being placed in the grave, where we see sometimes hundreds of ivory beads in the grave. But we seem to have a connection across a very wide landscape, a cultural connection. And interestingly, the Red Lady of Paviland, the name has stuck, is the earliest. So it may be even that we're looking at a culture which originates in the West and spreads east. We're so used, aren't we, to thinking that culture comes to us from the east spreading west. But maybe it's the other way round here. If we look out of the cave mouth there, you can see that you're looking out on a vast grassy plain. And that is what it would have been like 34,000 years ago. Because you're cooling down to the peak of the last ice age, there's so much water locked up as ice, and it's cold, so the remaining sea takes up less volume as well. The coast would have been 70 miles further out than it is today, and the Paleo 7 would have been snaking its way across that plain which is full of animals, This is a good place for hunter-gatherers to be. This is what this man and his people would have been. So it would have been teeming with animals like woolly mammoth, woolly rhino, all of those incredible Ice Age megafauna. And that's what they were doing there. They were hunting those animals. Why did they bury him in that cave? He's a youngish man. Can't tell how he died, looking at the remains of his skeleton. And the temptation, I think, is to think that he was somebody really special. A leader, a chieftain, a shaman, a priest of some kind. And that may be right. But Paul Pettit told me to think more widely and to consider all of the possibilities. It's an unusual burial. Not many people are buried at this time. We can say that. So most people are not being buried. Most people are somehow scattered to the four winds. So it was an unusual thing to do. It marks somebody out as very special. But it could be special in a different way. It could be that he had done something wrong as far as his society was concerned, and he had to be contained in that way. It could be that he died a bad death, a hunting accident or something. And that was the way that he was going to be interred and remembered. So we do have to break away from our stereotypes, our prejudices, and try and think very widely. And then where we can, test our assumptions and our theories about the past. And where we can't, approach it in as open-minded a way as possible. So we'll leave him there in his cave on the coast of Wales and move now in time and place. So he's buried back in the Upper Paleolithic, right in the Ice Age. The ice sheets come down and people disappear after the Red Lady of Paviland and his people were there, and then eventually come back as the world starts to warm up again. So by around 15,000 years ago, we've got people coming back into Britain, totally dry feet, walking across the land bridge, across what's now under the North Sea, Doggerland, as we call it, walking across into Britain. And then eventually the world warms up and up and up, and the sea levels rise, and we're cut off as an island. And then after we're cut off as an island, the first farmers arrive. And the first farmers get to Britain around 6,000 years ago. So our version of farming originates from Anatolia. That's where we see the domestication of the founder crops of the Neolithic, things like wheat, barley, rye, oats, and the animals, so cattle, sheep, pigs, goats, all being domesticated hundreds of miles away, thousands of miles away in Anatolia from 11,000 years ago. And then over 5 millennia, it percolates westwards. And this is now Ex Oriente Lux. It's coming from the east to the west and eventually washes up on British shores. And it does wash up on British shores. People would have been coming with boats. I mean, it's just astonishing to think about these people bringing their crops, bringing their animals, and settling in Britain in the Neolithic, bringing a new way of burying the dead as well. So this is when we see these amazing Neolithic long barrows, and here's Adam's grave in Pewsey Vale, one of my favourites, Hetty Pegler's Tump, I don't know who Hetty Pegler is, or Ewley Long Barrow. And these are communal burials, so we see lots and lots and lots where when they haven't been excavated in the past or raided in the past. When we're lucky enough to see them today for the first time, they're full of human remains. These are communal burials. And I was lucky enough to see one just last summer when we were filming the 12th series of Digging for Britain. We're just starting series 13. And I was up in Orkney where we were looking at a similar kind of grave, a chambered cairn. And you can see each of these chambers quite nicely there. And in one of them, you've got articulated skeletons. I'm always amazed, looking at archaeology each year and going out and having the privilege of filming it, that there are new things to find, new discoveries to be made. And I think that's the reason the BBC commissions Digging for Britain. I mean, it goes out on a bit of a limb. I think it's the only thing it commissions where it doesn't know what's going to be in it at this time of the year. This is astonishing because mostly what we find in these Neolithic tombs is a jumble of bones, and we actually thought that was part of the funerary process. But here we've got actual articulated skeletons, as you can just about see. So the skeletons are there. The bodies have been laid complete into the tomb with I think between 8 and 14 in each of these chambers. So it's just astonishing. After those farmers arriving, we then move on to another phase that we call after the technology that emerges at this time. So we now move into the Bronze Age. And this takes us to very close to this famous site, iconic archaeological site, which is much easier to recognise if you look at it from that angle. And just down the road from Stonehenge is the small town of Amesbury. And in 2002, archaeologists discovered an amazing grave at Amesbury, one which has really kind of captured my imagination and tells us so much about people in the British landscape, but also about the way that scientific techniques are now unlocking a huge amount of information for us. So the archaeologists came across this burial. They weren't expecting it at all. They were doing a routine excavation ahead of a school being built on the outskirts of Amesbury. And they came across this pit, which just looks like a round, dark patch on the ground when you first come across it, and thought, oh, could it be a grave? Dig down a bit, start to find bits of pottery, which is characteristically Bronze Age. And in this early part of the Bronze Age, we often see that. We often see people being buried with pots. So they knew they had a Bronze Age grave. They carried on digging into the night, which is unusual, but it was just before a bank holiday weekend, and they didn't want anybody else coming and digging it over the weekend. And when they'd finished, they realised that they had actually stumbled across the most richly furnished Bronze Age grave that had ever been discovered in Britain. It was phenomenal. So you've got an individual now, so we're back to individual burials, and this individual is buried with around 100 objects. So we're going to learn a lot about this person's culture as well. You can see these kind of darker patches up towards the head end at the top, and those are completely pancaked vessels, pottery vessels. And this individual actually had 5 pottery vessels in the grave, and then a whole array of other objects, some of which you can see are a bit greenish, lots of things made out of stone, some boar's tusks, a whole array of objects made out of the kind of durable materials that will survive in this kind of burial environment. There must have been a lot of other stuff as well. And just, we're seeing the tip of the iceberg here. We're seeing the hard, durable things that have been preserved. Think about all the organic things, which we're not seeing. Anything made of wood, anything made of any kind of fabric, natural fibres, it's all rotted away. And this is what we're left with. We've got these amazing bone plaques, which are about 20 centimetres long with holes at the end, so they're obviously designed to be attached to something. We think they're probably wrist guards, because he was also found with 18 tanged arrowheads, beautiful, beautiful flint tanged arrowheads. He's become known as the Amesbury Archer. He's got the biggest collection of Bronze Age archery equipment that's ever been found. And again, we presume these were attached to arrows, the shafts of arrows, when they were actually placed in the grave. 3 copper knives. This is unprecedented. He's obviously somebody very special to have 3 copper knives. And I always wonder about, what they meant to him, because it's interesting. He's right at the dawn of the Bronze Age, and actually we're starting to separate out the first few centuries of the Bronze Age now as another age. Sorry about this. You might be very happy with the idea. You've got Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, that 3-age system. But we're now going Stone Age, Copper Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age. So for the first few centuries, people are making things out of copper, very malleable metal, before they start to alloy that copper with tin and make it a bit stronger. And copper's not strong, is it? It's bendy, you know what copper wires are like. And these copper knives are going to be pretty rubbish. You're not going to be able to cut anything hard with that. You'll just get nicks in the side of it. So I think it's a lot more to do with what they look like and what they represent. He's one of the earliest people in Britain to have metal. He might have been a metal worker himself. He's got a cushion stone for polishing. So perhaps it's about that. Perhaps it's about displaying this newfound technology, this newfound ability. I mean, what an amazing thing. Imagine seeing that for the first time. Somebody crushes up some stone, puts it in a furnace which looks a bit like a pottery kiln, you're familiar with that, and then gets out this stuff which is red hot, white hot fluid, pouring it into a mould, and then it hardens and it becomes this entirely new material. I mean, it must have seemed like magic. I think a lot of technology seems like magic to me today. In fact, even electricity, I'm amazed every time I flick a light switch. I mean, yeah. I did physics A-level, but I still don't understand it. He also had this metal, and the archaeologists, when they were digging his grave, realized they were onto something very special as they were digging that evening. They saw the gleam of gold. Unlike the copper, which tarnishes, becomes completely greened with age, verdigris, it's lovely in some ways. Gold just comes out of the ground, as gold as the day it went in the ground. It is astonishing. I don't know if they did the gold dance. As I said, he was also buried with these beakers, and these beakers give their name to the whole culture. And so we end up talking about the Beaker culture, and historically we've talked about the Beaker folk, or the Beaker people, as though we could somehow associate a group of people with a particular culture. That's a problematic thing to do, as archaeologists are very fond of saying, pots are not people. You can give a pot to somebody else, that doesn't make a person the same person as you. So there's been this enduring question about where this culture comes from that's been very difficult to answer, again, until you get the scientific techniques coming along. So obviously archaeologists and early antiquarians were aware of this phenomenon, going back as early as the 18th, 19th centuries. But before they could actually date everything, it was very opaque as to how it was spreading and in which direction it was spreading. So once we got to the point where we're radiocarbon dating things, suddenly it became clearer. And it becomes clearer that it is on the European continent before it's in Britain. So we can quite robustly derive an idea there that people are travelling from the European continent to Britain and bringing these ideas with them. Ideas which are about how to make a certain style of pottery, but also about metalworking, also about a particular style of burial, and possibly about language as well. So that was kind of where we were at in, I suppose, 2017. We were still kind of going, there's some people coming over to Britain with these ideas, and these ideas are spreading. But how many people? How profound was this? Was it just a few people coming over? A few maybe elite people, and those ideas are spreading because they're such good ideas and they spread through the population? Or was it a more profound population replacement? We just didn't have the evidence to decide between those different scenarios. And then genetics comes along. And you know what genetics does? You can look at your family history. So we can go back and look at the family history of ancient people. And we can trace family relationships through time. So geneticists looked at, and they did this broadly right across Europe, they looked at the genomes of Neolithic people, those farmers, and then they looked at the genomes of the Bronze Age people who came later, the Beaker people. And they said, okay, do these Beaker people look like the direct descendants, like the lineal descendants of those Neolithic farmers? And looking at Britain, the answer is no. And in fact, what it looks like is that there was a profound population replacement, a 90% population replacement in the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE. The newspapers got hold of this, and there were incendiary headlines, not in the Times, I hope, but incendiary headlines along the lines of Dutch invaders killed off the people who made Stonehenge. Okay, well, we don't know if it was an invasion. It could have been an invasion, or it could have been a peaceful thing. We don't know that anybody was killed. They could have been killed, but we don't have the evidence for that. And also, we're looking at something that at the moment, the degree of resolution that we've got on this is that it's happening over centuries, over, say, 3 centuries. Now, it may be that it happened in 2 years in the middle of those 3 centuries, but we don't know at the moment. So the ball's now back in the archaeologist's court, but we mustn't, again, jump to conclusions once we know that actually that migration is playing a role. We can say that. So migration is playing a role in this culture change. But we can't go into any more details about how that felt on the ground, how that played out on the ground. And so we need to go back to the archaeology again. And undoubtedly, we'll get more information about that. And undoubtedly, it will be different in different places because people are diverse and do lots of different things. That's what makes anthropology so interesting. Otherwise, it would be boring. So we know that the Amesbury Archer then is part of this much bigger story of a big migration into Britain in the 3rd millennium BCE. And I suppose we're then looking at him and going, oh, hang on a minute, is he one of them? Has he come from the European continent to Britain? He's there very early, so 2300 BCE. Could he be one of the first people, right in that kind of, right, pioneering, bringing Beaker culture into Britain? We can look at his DNA, which has been hard to extract, but eventually he yielded it up. And we can see that he has that signature of the migration in his DNA, but that doesn't necessarily mean he himself was a migrant. Because as you know, you inherit your DNA, so it could have been he could have been 2nd generation, 3rd generation. He's downstream somehow, or he could have been a migrant himself. There's another extremely brilliant bit of scientific technique that we can use to look at him himself and not just his ancestry, and that is a secret buried in his teeth. Because when you make your teeth, which is when you're children, I always think I talk a lot about evolution much more broadly and the flaws of evolution and, the things we could have done better. And if I had the power to do it, I would do it better. It's like sharks have lots of teeth over the course of their lives. I'd quite like another set of teeth right now. I imagine quite a lot of you would. It'd be quite nice. Apart from the pain of it, which is another flaw, why do babies have to have painful teething? Oh, what a ridiculous thing. Anyway, so there's lots of things I would change. I did do a whole programme about that once and made a really horrendous redesign of my body, which was in the Science Museum for a while. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent. You make your teeth when you're a child, and you make yourself out of your environment. You are what you eat, and when you're growing, as I consistently tell my children, everything you're putting in your mouth is going to end up part of you. So you are absorbing your environment and growing and using that material in a very real way. Those atoms that have come from your food are going into your body. So you're building your teeth from your environment, and there's a connection between the groundwater in a certain place where you are and then the chemical signature that ends up in your body. And in your teeth, as I've said, you make your teeth and then you leave them there. So you're not constantly remaking them. You constantly remake your skeleton about once every 10 years. You haven't got the skeleton you had 10 years ago. You've got a completely different skeleton. It's like HMS Victory. It's not a single plank of it, which is original, and it's the same as your skeleton. It's not the same skeleton it was 10 years ago. Your teeth, different. You make your teeth, that's it. You just leave them alone. So your teeth record your childhood, and they record what you were putting in your mouth when you were a child. And the chemical signature, which we pick up in isotopes, so variants of oxygen and strontium in your teeth, can be matched with geology. He did not grow up on Salisbury Plain. He grew up about 800 miles away around what's now the Alps. Well, it was the Alps then, but they probably didn't call them the Alps. So he is a migrant. And we've got, this is mind-blowing. This was never written down. No, none of his biography was ever written down. This is pre-history, before the written word. And yet we've got an aspect of his biology. We know he grew up in the Alps. We know he was buried on Salisbury Plain. We talk about osteobiography. I suppose we should talk about Odonto biography as well, if we're getting things from his teeth. We know he walked with a limp. He had a disability. He had a withered left leg, probably following an injury to his knee. His disability didn't detract from his status. He's got strange shoulders. I could talk a lot about shoulders, I won't. But he's got detached ends of his shoulder blades, ossicromiale, we call it. It might be linked to archery, we're not sure. But he's this incredible person. He's kind of time traveled to us, bringing his culture to us, but also bringing clues about how that culture came to Britain. And we're going to leave him there in his grave 43 centuries ago, this time-traveling, bow-wielding, metal-bending magician from the dawn of the Copper Age. He's one of my favourite ancestors. I'm finishing with a story which is very recent in that it's revelations that emerged into public consciousness, I suppose, with a publication just last year based on burials from Dorset that I've been following for a long time. This site has featured several times on Digging for Britain because it is so fascinating. And it takes us to the Iron Age, so we're into the next age now, and we're looking at people who lived in Britain between 2,000 and 3,000 years ago. And during that time, actually, we don't have many burials in Britain. We talk about the disappearing dead of the Iron Age. We don't know what people were doing with their dead, cremating them, maybe scattering them, leaving them out as sky burials. There's lots of possibilities, but whatever it is they were doing across Britain, it's largely archaeologically invisible, apart from a couple of places. Yorkshire, where we get astonishing chariot burials from the Iron Age, and who knows, that newly reported pieces of a chariot might have been associated with the burial. I'd like to think it was Cartimandra. Anyway, down in Dorset, we also get burials as well. And some of them are rather odd. So Miles Russell at the University of Bournemouth has been looking at these burials for a number of years now. This is actually not a purpose-built grave. This is probably a grain storage pit, which is being reused for an individual that has been buried face down, prone. There's a lot of very strange to us. I mean, we'd have to be very careful again, and I need to check my own prejudices there. When we approach the past and go, that looks like an odd burial, they'd look at us going, what do? You cremate your dead and then you grind them up? We grind them up. It's very strange. So we've got all these burials, and these bones are telling us something about those individuals, and are full of DNA. So there was this phenomenal ancient DNA project looking at Iron Age people from Dorset, and it really was. I love it when it challenges preconceptions. You know, it doesn't just kind of go, oh well, that's what we thought anyway. So you know, it kind of fills in the gaps. This has really challenged our preconceptions of what ancient societies were like, and what this study showed us was something about the structure and the kinship and the families of these Iron Age societies. So again, just as in the same way that we can use DNA today to look at family history, we can look at family histories in the past. And we're also looking at people in a certain place. So we're combining place and ancestry. And crucially, what we could see in this study was that if we followed lines of descent down, women seemed to be staying put, and men were moving away from the communities that they were born in. And we call that matrilocality, and it's unusual. It's unusual when we look at what we know about historical societies and cultures. The more prevalent way that societies have been set up is patrilocality, where sons will stay put and daughters move away. when you have patrilocality, that often goes hand in hand with inherited status, land rights, wealth. And so the sons are inheriting the right to that particular area of land, they're inheriting the status in that place. The daughters are marrying into other communities and creating links between different kinship groups. So we're seeing the opposite in Iron Age Britain. It is unusual, and it's unusual from what we know of other ancient DNA studies of prehistoric societies. But perhaps we shouldn't have been so surprised, because actually when we look at the Iron Age record that we've got, the burial record that we've got, we more often find high status items buried with women than with men. And also, I think actually the Romans gave us quite a big clue, because the Romans did write about prehistoric Britain. So even though prehistoric Britain is prehistoric, the Romans are kind of looking at us, eyeing us up, aren't they? I mean, it's like War of the Worlds. They're kind of going, yes, watching us, not through their telescopes. They didn't have telescopes back then, but working out when they're going to come and take over. And they write all sorts of stuff about Britons, but Celts more generally. And they portray us as being very barbaric. I say us, the people of Britain, you know, whoever you are, the people who were here in Britain 2,000 years ago. They're looking at us and going, oh, you need civilizing. There were 3 reasons why they thought we needed civilizing. We wore trousers, barbaric. We drank undiluted wine, terrible, atrocious behaviour. And we had female leaders. Can you imagine how barbaric that is? So some of that might have been propaganda, but it looks like there's a grain of truth to it. And we think about the stories of Cartimandua and Boudicca, of course, and they're iconic and they stand out, but perhaps this was just part of what Iron Age British society was like. It's astonishing to know that from looking at bones. And so if I bring that all together, what I'm left with is lots and lots of connections. The way that we can connect up science and history, genetics and archaeology, the way that we can see people in the landscape, their connections with the landscape, our connections with the landscape today, connections between different groups of people, culture, spreading as people move around, the importance of migration in the past, bringing those cultures into Britain, and the absolute importance and value of a monumental walk. And that monumental walk, as I said at the beginning, depends on the value that people bring to the National Trust. All of those people that give up their weekends and their free time and cut back the gorse and cut back the brambles and put in new gateposts and keep these places open for all of us. It's such a precious gift. Thank you.